World Genocide Day is being commemorated across the globe today. The event is instituted by the United Nations to highlight society's responsibility to prevent future atrocities. Rwanda, of course, one of the most significant cases in the world. The country went through a horrific genocide in 1994, which claimed about 1 million lives. To discuss more on this, we've got Afro expert Chadia Tapio-Diamond here in the studio with me, and then we also have Kwezi Mkhabisa from the African Centre for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes in our Durban studios. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. I thought to start, it being a day marked very much and driven by the United Nations, some very strong comments coming from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres on Friday, talking around the marking of this very important day. And he admitted, and I quote, "Tragically, the international community has sometimes failed to heed the warning signs and take early and decisive action rather than preventing genocide. We are still reacting to it, often too late." Chadia, was that, in your opinion, the case in Rwanda?
Well, when we speak of genocide, as far as the world and the examples are concerned, I believe the international community has not done anything with regards to stopping and avoiding such things from happening. Just by looking at it, from 1948, when the Genocide Convention was ratified and adopted, World Genocide Day has only been celebrated 3 times. So that on its own, it tells you that the international community does not take and does not want to combat the issues of genocide. Genocide on the bucket list of international community is not there on the list. So his statements, I take them with a pinch of salt, because when we look at reality, it's nowhere. And the United Nations has got all the powers, but they've not been doing anything towards combating the recurrence of genocide.
Kwezi, if I could bring you in here, those comments from the UN Secretary General admitting that the international community has often been too slow to heed those warning signs before these huge atrocities actually take place. What do you make of that?
Well, as a starting point, I think we need to consider a bit of background. When the Rwandese genocide took place in 1994, it took place with the United Nations that had just adopted a seminal document called Agenda for Peace. Within that document, the then Secretary General Boutros Ghali, he called upon the international community to start working and putting into place various mechanisms and structures for the express purpose of maintaining peace and security and preventing atrocities. Now, 25 or so years later, Antonio Guterres, the new Secretary General, repeats the very same call. When he took office, he talked about the importance of prevention. And I think that whilst it might be a wish on his part, structurally, the United Nations has got a lot more to do in motivating for member countries to stop molesting their own people, because these atrocities and genocide do not occur in a vacuum. The perpetrators, in most part, are also member states of the United Nations. So structurally, we've got a long way to go as humanity.
Now, if you look at the case of Rwanda, Kwezi, we had, on the back of that atrocious genocide, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. In your opinion, has that tribunal been successful in holding perpetrators to account?
I have got a very interesting view that is contrary to the one held by many mainstream commentators on the use of some of these international tools. I think the real work of reconciliation that we can attribute to the post-genocide Rwanda actually happened within Rwanda itself, where they actually had an indigenous gacaca system that was looking at actually directly reconciling perpetrators and some of the victims, or at least the families of victims of the genocide. Now, yes, the tribunal in Arusha did tick a box for the international community to say at least some of the institutional, structural tools that we have in our toolbox to respond post-genocide have worked. But I don't think the real question and real challenge is whether these post-genocide instruments actually work better or not. I think we need to be asking ourselves is structurally what is being done in order to prevent end the atrocities before we go around the continent chasing people in order to place them and parade them in some form of public trial. That doesn't really help for the victims of the genocide. It doesn't help for the society in which the genocide took place. So I think we need to evaluate what our criteria for what is workable and what is not working.
Chadia, that's a fascinating take there on the processes of holding people accountable and indeed the processes of identifying those seeds that would eventually become full-blown hate and crimes that would eventually be qualified as genocide. That there's too much of an emphasis on the international, and let's call it what it is, a Western way of dealing with these issues, and not enough of an emphasis on how Africa would deal with those kinds of issues.
Well, in Africa, we put the spirit of Ubuntu, which speaks of the community, that we believe in communal people living within a community, where if ever there are issues that have to be dealt within the community, we prefer more as Africans having alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, which has worked very well in Rwanda. Because like what my learned colleague is actually saying, that it was the people within, because we tend to focus more on the perpetrator and then forget about the rights, about the personal, emotional well-being of the victim. And that has been happening in so many other areas in the world. A very good example is here in Southern Africa, where we have, in Zimbabwe, people are speaking of the Gukurahundi. Those atrocities have not been addressed. There's been no internal process of reconciliation and healing of the people, which is different from what happened in Rwanda. In Rwanda, there was that intimate platform where the victims and the perpetrators came on the same table. And then we have seen that the development of Rwanda is moving towards one direction together as a people, which is a better way of dealing with these issues. Because if you look at the international institutions, it's a tick box. I concur with that. There is nothing more that they just do than just to get one or two people. And it's very costly and expensive that money and those resources could actually be plowed into formidable other exercises within the community.
Because it's interesting about Rwanda. A few months ago, we spoke to somebody who works within the youth in Rwanda, and they're dealing with a generation that now are born into society post-genocide, who only read about the genocide in books and in documentaries. And it's interesting that they believe more work needs to be done to ensure that those seeds don't blossom again eventually, so that everybody is educated about what led to it. Do you think enough is being done from what you understand in Rwanda?
Rwanda is a very good example, and I believe Rwanda is still a growing economy. It's a fast upcoming economy. The fact that the people of Rwanda themselves took it upon themselves to say, this is how we want to deal with our own situation, it brought in the good seed as what is in Rwanda now. Had probably the international community been more involved in it, we would have probably seen a bitter people coming out of Rwanda. But we thank God on how they dealt with the issues internally.
Kwesi, just your take on how Rwanda is both dealing with their own process of reconciliation, as you spoke about earlier, while at the same time educating the next generation about what happened. Do you think that they're getting it right?
Well, I think all references to whether they are getting it right or they have done enough in order to get it right would be responded to even by Rwandese officials themselves, to say that they are a work in progress. The reality of the matter, if we are to scale what needs to happen, it is about helping people reimagine a society beyond ethnic identity. It is about reimagining a society whose level of cohesion is not defined by how well the economy does, or for that matter how connected it is to ITC and the regional economy, but the extent to which they can live amongst themselves. They could coexist, as it were. And I think the efforts that have been made by government have actually attempted a multi-layer interventions. Yes, the economy is important. If you go back to the Gachacha system, which was looking at reconciling the perpetrators and victims or families of victims, it didn't only stop there. It actually had a socio-economic element that actually acknowledged that as a result of the dastardly act of the genocide, people's livelihoods would have been disrupted. The socio-economic infrastructure that defines a coherent country would have been eroded. And all the interventions that we have seen thus far have been an effort on the part of government to actually activate some of these institutional, infrastructural, psychosocial. So it's really work in progress, but it's very commendable what they've attempted to do. It doesn't mean that for some of us who are in conflict management, we consider that the root causes, or for that matter, the triggering elements are still not there. Just like in any other country, Rwanda has some serious fault lines that it has to address, both internally, regionally, and otherwise. And I think that this is the real challenge of the future for not the government of Rwanda, but for the society of Rwanda, on how they are to maintain and redefine the level of coherence they wish to have.
From what I understand from speaking to journalists who covered Rwanda at the time, what happened there almost caught specifically the media and indeed the international community at large by surprise. Now, we keep hearing, if you keep an eye on international media, that the rise of nationalism, particularly in the West, people are saying is a ticking time bomb. Do you believe that enough of an eye is being kept on the so-called fear of the other across the continent and in various communities so that those red flags can be put up in time for something like Rwanda to be prevented in future? Where do you start?
Important question. The reality of the matter is that if we as outsiders, when I say outsiders, I mean anyone who's an outsider looking into the continent, they would actually make reference when we're talking about conflicts, disagreements, disputes, and violence, as it were. They're almost always talking, oh, we're taken by surprise. We're never really taken by surprise, to tell you the truth. I mean, the records that are coming out right now in terms of what happened in Rwanda tell us that the warning signs were there. The United Nations was warned. The regional economic community of East African states was active. There were efforts in talks in Arusha, in Tanzania, and elsewhere. So it's not true, firstly, that we don't have sufficient early warning. There is sufficient data that indicates where problems are. But here's my second main point. Our entire response is actually built on the notion that it's states that have got to respond to this conflict. Even when you talk about the international media, when they talk about early warning, they don't go to the authorities and communities that will be affected by these conflicts or where the conflict is brewing. They all run to New York to go and inform the United Nations. They all run to Addis Ababa to inform the African Union and go elsewhere. So I think we all of us need to change our thinking from saying that things must be good to actually saying that what needs to be done in order for these things to happen. And our early warning and mechanisms must not be looking at people acting from somewhere, but we need to be looking at how to hold those governments that are molesting their own people accountable, how to single out and snuff out the oxygen that makes it possible for rebel leaders or criminal gangs to graduate to become militias, to graduate to become rebels, and then later on cause civil wars and some of the strifes and atrocities and genocide we're talking about. So until we can do those small little basic things, I think many of us will feel far more contributing to a healthy discussion around how to prevent genocide and atrocities.
I feel there's so much more to talk about this, but unfortunately we've run out of time, gentlemen. I thank you so much for your time and your fantastic insight. Afro expert here in the studio, Chadia Tapiwa Diamond, and conflict specialist in Durban, Kwezi Mqebisa. Thank you so much. The conversation will indeed continue.